So we're going on to our last video on Eric Liddell from this book, Complete Surrender. Great book on Eric Liddell's life by Julian Wilson. And so we got to the part, and we're actually on chapter 10, if you can look in your book, about what was going on in the midst of China and the wartime, and how Eric now was actually ministering in war times, harsh times, and giving the gospel and helping people. So Japanese soldiers now were like entering the missionary homes, and a lot of them were drunk and they were coming through and they were killing people, killing missionaries in 1941. The missionaries all were ordered to evacuate because Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor, and now the United States, as well as, China, and just, as well as the Allies were against Japan. And so we're talking about a harsh World War II. And so Eric Liddell, he stayed to help the others. He decided not to run away at this time. In fact, we know that he sent in May 1941, right before this all happened, he sent his wife and his children back to Canada, actually, where her family was in the midst. And so this would go on for 4 years, 4 whole years in the midst. Eric would not see his wife. In fact, she would never see him again. Eric says, all on page 113, if you want to look it up in your book, Eric said, all his happiness, the happiness that shone so radically from his face, all this happiness had its basis in his serene faith in God, his love for God, and his appreciation of God's gifts. So Eric, all still, was focusing on God. So what happened then? Well, they gathered up the missionaries, and where would they put him? They'd put him in a concentration camp, internment camp, they called it, Japanese internment camp. On March 12th, 1943, they had to report to the Civil Assembly in China, and they were marked and they were marched through the streets as a final act of humiliation to them. All these different foreigners, not all of them, a lot of them missionaries, but a lot of them foreigners, and they had a 16-hour journey to this camp. When they got to the camp, it was actually a Presbyterian camp, where the Presbyterians actually had their church and their buildings but it all had been torn apart. The beds were torn apart, the pipes were taken out, furniture was gone, radiators were even ripped out. And so there was nothing there, and that's where they would have to stay. They called it the courtyard of the happy way. There was a sign, courtyard of the happy way. Was not happy, that's for sure. In fact, the camp toilets and everything and all the smell was very overwhelming stench, was right when you came into the campground of the happy way. And there were cesspools all over the place, flies and disease. There would be 1,800 prisoners, internees, they called them, internees coming in. And in the midst of their food, they would have hard bread, maybe some stew that was called the same old stew made of eggplant, peanut shells, revolting liver, and some meat had maggots on it. So it was pretty gross environment. Parasites and vermin, mosquitoes and malaria, bed bugs, lots of bed bugs, lack of space. They all were crowded together. Yep. It surely was a concentration camp. Eric Liddell, he would always, though, try to keep the youth going, the pastime. He even found this little game of chess, and so he'd play chess with them or try to make models out of things or work with them. And then he would get them out and run with them, get them to run a bit or to exercise and such. So he was always doing something to encourage, especially the young people. And his food and his parcels that he got for food, because it happened that the Japanese soldiers, they would give him more food because they knew he was an Olympic runner, and then they went to race with him. I guess one guy tried to race him So I'll race you on Sunday. But Eric, at that he couldn't race. He wouldn't race, and so he ran, but he just whatever. But he ended later on racing for medical supplies. So and he won. So in the midst he still was running for Jesus. Carrie Malcolm said, and when she was in the camp there, she said that she was single-handedly trying to kill these hundreds of flies, and there were 600 people coming to eat, and she was trying to just kill all these flies. There were tons of flies, and so Eric came through because Eric had been her softball coach before in the mission, and Bible teacher, and he stopped and he smiled, and he said. He said that she said, as a Christian, you're bringing people to Christ by doing something as simple as killing flies. He said, and he thanked her. He said, thank you for killing these flies. And he said, basically now her testimony would be come forth. Even the things that that nobody notices that we do, God notices. So he basically told her, keep doing these things for the Lord, even killing flies. God knows what you're doing. Very sweet. Eric also would have Bible studies and puppet shows for the kids during the time he was in the concentration camp. He'd teach the teenagers, and the teenagers would cling to wherever he went. They wanted to be wherever Eric was. He even sold his gold watch somehow or pawned it off so that he could get supplies, so that he could have some equipment. He actually got some equipment for softball equipment in the midst of a camp so they could play. So, but Eric also, he started getting migraine headaches, and he was getting very malnourished, let's say, and he started becoming a little bit forgetful. He thought he was losing ground. Now, we're talking about he's not elderly at this point. He's in his 40s there. And so he's starting to notice that things are not quite right, but he still was smiling. He was still trying to teach, and he got influenza and sinusitis, and then he had a possible stroke, and he had a partial part of his right leg was like paralyzed for a while, and his speech was slurred, and I didn't know. He goes, what was going on? But still, he kept focusing on the Lord Jesus Christ. Later on, they'll find that he had a brain tumor. He actually died of a brain tumor that was complicated by the situation in the concentration camp. The whole time, though, he'd be looking at his photos of his wife and family, knowing maybe I won't be able to see them again, and praying for them. He said, one thing troubles me. I ought to have been able to cast on the Lord and not be broken. So he thought, I wish, I had cast it on the Lord. And he was, but he was having a hard time casting everything on the Lord at this time, especially with all the health problems he was having. And he had even written his wife, someone actually had typed it up, where he said, that he's carrying, the doctor thought he was carrying too much responsibility, that he was having a nervous breakdown. Well, he wasn't having a nervous breakdown. He was having a brain tumor, so in the midst, you think, Eric. So, Annie, his friend, or Annie, she was actually at the hospital there when he came to the hospital. She wrote about Eric's complete surrender. And if you go to page, I think it's 130, she writes, he was a man who'd been surrendering to God all his life and didn't give up. It cost him everything, but he was under complete surrender. You see, Eric knew where he was going. He knew where he was going. It's important that you know where you're going when you die. He knew. He knew he would be at peace in the Lord Jesus Christ. His brain tumor on his left side, and he died 6 months before the camp was liberated. The Americans came in, American paratroopers, 6 of them came in and liberated the camp in China. And that entry set them free. People wept and they danced and they hugged and they got together and they celebrated with, on their release, they had been in that camp, in that concentration camp for 3 years. 3 years of hunger, filth, squalor, vermin, and death and disease. They were at last free from all these things. The children were reunited with their parents, and parents with their wives. They're all reunited, but all of them, they never forgot Eric Liddell. Eric Liddell, I should say. That's how you pronounce his name, Liddell. Never forgot Eric. The last chapter is called Sincere. So they had Eric's grave at the camp, and the biggest funeral, and everyone came, and everyone knew and spoke. A lot of people spoke what they knew of his walk with the Lord. One said he was not particularly clever and not conspicuously able at times, but he was really good. He was good. He was sincere, without wax. You know, they used to put wax on things to hide things, and then when it get hot, they'd fall apart. You know, but he was sincere, without wax. That's what sincere means. Of all the men I've ever known, Eric was the one in whose character and the spirit of Jesus was predominantly manifested sincerely. What was the secret of his consecrated life? What was this far-reaching influence that he had? Absolute surrender to God's will revealed in the Lord Jesus Christ. He was a God-controlled person. I love that. Paul says to run to win. He ran to win, and he indeed won. You can imagine he's the bema seat of Christ, getting his rewards of all those he led to Jesus in the midst of being an Olympic star. He's a heaven-bound bema seat star in heaven. God indeed has rewards for those who honor him, and pray that you would honor. Before he died, he wrote down something that was actually right before the same day that he died. He walked up the steps to give somebody back something that he had borrowed, and then he walked back down, and that night he passed away. But before that, he wrote down some words on a scrap of paper, and it said, "Be still, my soul. Be still, peace, my soul, be still." And he went to be with Jesus. So the last part talks about his legacy goes on, and even today his legacy goes on as the man who won the Olympics in the Olympics of 1929 said, "I'm not going to race on Sunday because I honor God." And God indeed honored him. His life, his race was run. It was an Olympic race. His race was run in his life. And as a teacher, as a missionary, as a pastor. And, as an encourager in the worst of times in China. He had led many to Jesus. And that was Eric Liddell. He indeed won the race. He indeed was a man of complete surrender.